And in the films, very dramatically, I think we saw hostility at its worst, and then the hope that some kind of reconciliation might emerge through some of the heroic figures we saw in your movies. And then Pádraig's very practical steps in getting people bringing them to a place, no agenda, and seeing what happens. And a few things struck me in relation again to our seminar, one being the idea of the different divided cities hosting each other, being very analogous to what we're trying to do with the guest book, which will travel from Ireland to Bangalore to Kathmandu, to Cairo, and to Jerusalem, where each of the cities will host the other. So I was very struck by this because Pádraig and I haven't had a chance to discuss the respective projects.
Not for 25 years.
Not for 25 years. Although we did work quite a bit 25 years ago on the whole Northern Ireland process. So that's very comforting to hear and intriguing. The parallels, obviously Pádraig is working on a much more concrete political level and is much more advanced, but we can learn something from that precedent. And I was also very struck by the power of testimony and narrative and the exchange of narratives when you put people into these rooms, even if they're separated, that like the AA meetings, when people hear each other tell their stories, some kind of healing happens. How is another question. Why when people exchange memories, stories, testimonies, does something happen? Through this power of community or conversation or attestation that doesn't seem to happen when people are alone or isolated. And a third point, and this is maybe more of a question which we can discuss, is coming back to your first point about killers make the best negotiators. And I just wonder at what point, are we talking about a killer or an ex-killer? And coming back to your example of Mandela saying to the Unionists, Protestants in South Africa, when they came to South Africa, look, in their separate room, you don't have to keep ceasefire and decommissioning as one. You can decouple them. But the ceasefire was nonetheless a precondition. And that seems to suggest that the killer has to become, at least in part, an ex-killer before negotiations can take place. And one wonders at what point that happens. You know, the hostile becomes hospitable. Say in figures like, I don't know, Gerry Adams, Michael Collins, Begin, Golda Meir, Gaddafi, I mean, Mandela himself perhaps. At what point does one cross the line from killer to ex-killer so that negotiations can take place? Or does one simply talk to the killers as killers and post the stranger, the enemy, the adversary, without preconditions, in the hope that in the conversation the killer will become an ex-killer, at least for a while? So there are just some comments and questions, but I don't want to monopolize things, so maybe that can come up in discussion and we can take some questions. Susan.
As you just said, Richard, I was thinking, I can't think of the name of the film we saw a few years ago, because when you were speaking about the killer and then also the addiction, and in the films that you've worked on and I've been able to work with you on, it's clearly about the addiction which hides or prevents the humanity from coming through. When the humanity comes through, the self and the other dissolve, transcend, whatever. And there was a film, remember there was a guy who was a mafia hitman who was an alcoholic, and he's sent away to AA in California. Remember this? Just years ago. And as he goes to his AA meetings, he begins to understand who he is, falls in love, cleans up his act, and moves from being killer to ex-killer to human being. But it's all tied up with what you were talking about, the addiction, because we live in a world that is addictive. Whether it's work, which is a forgivable addiction, or alcohol or drugs, or all these things are addictions which I think prevent the humanity from coming through. So I know what you're doing, this guy was, and I think in your films as well, when you can get these people to come together and let go of their addictive feelings, addictions, or their fears, and see that we're all in the same boat, it's sinking. No one gets out of this life alive. And that we suffer more in solidarity than alone. Voila, there it is. I can't think of the name of that film. John, you won't.
I can't remember.
There you go.
I don't like the movies. That's what Fellini said.
Or do you want to take a shot at that? And to when killing doesn't work. And the analogy I would use is of one of what is insanity? Sanity and insanity. And insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if I put my hand over an open flame and I get burned, and I come away and I go back and I look at the flame, I put my hand over it again, and I get burnt again, and I go away, and then I come back a third time. I say, I wonder what the result would be different if I do the same thing again. That's insanity. So it's when the killer gets to the point of saying, I am doing the same thing over and over again. And I'm getting, guess what? I'm getting the same result over and over again. When that realization, I think, kicks in, is when the first doubt is planted in his mind or her mind as to the efficacy of violence. And once a doubt is planted, then the use of violence again by that person can never be the same, because the certainty in what it will achieve is gone. Now, the second part of to use the addictive analogy, is that people in divided societies that I've looked at, become addicted to their own conflicts. The conflicts become part of who they are. And in part, they take their identity out of those conflicts. I mean, you get a couple of guys here who are over from the Springfield Road or the Falls Road in Northern Ireland, or the Shankill Road. My God, they're treated to everything. Oh, you're from Northern Ireland, you're from Belfast. Oh, yeah. I can tell you all about it, I know all about it. Well, they love it. They love the attention that comes with it. And they don't want to give it up. And suddenly find they're being treated as ordinary. So the loss of taking away the conflict is part of taking away a bit of their identity. And that in itself is something they grieve for, and there has to be a process of going through dealing with loss. And to me, if I was using a model of reconciliation, it would almost be more on the basis of Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of death that have to be gone through before the process of reconciliation can begin. And I am one of those who put a question mark beside whether Northern Ireland is ready yet for a truth commission that would open up the horrors of the past, because it's still too tight under the skins. People are too dirt. What about they're still coming up? What about this and what about that? My family and your family. It's raw, very raw. Some way must be found for them to go through that grieving process before they will get to a point of saying, maybe, just maybe now we are ready to talk about real reconciliation, not the surface reconciliation we had in South Africa, because what Father Helmut was referring to was Archbishop Tutu on the 10th anniversary of the Truth Commission. Said, you whites are a very lucky bunch. Blacks could have turned on you and just slaughtered all of you, taking your houses, taking your possessions. And 10 years after the Truth Commission, the leading white political figures in the country stood up and said, what have we got to be sorry about? We left you a first world country. That's what we left you. We formed 3/4 of the tax base. Whites in South Africa never think they did anything wrong with apartheid. They have never collectively admitted to any wrongdoing. They're in denial about their own past. That's me.
Ray or John, do you want to come in on that before we take any more questions?
I want to make sure that we do get some questions. Yeah. Let's see.
Justin.
Yeah, I had a question, and it pertains to, say, if you took, for example, the whites in South Africa, if they were actually to acknowledge their wrongdoing, to an extent, isn't there an opposite process that could happen to a group for doing that? So, I mean, if you were to look at a certain, size of the population in Germany that to this day, in a sense, don't cherish who they are as Germans and their history because of things that happened during World War II and in the Holocaust. So I was just wondering to what way is there to in a sense, find a balance between those two extremes? If you have any ideas on that, so where we're not going to be people that try to just completely forget our history and the positive things about that, but also acknowledge the wrongdoing done as well.
I pick up on that. There's a very interesting book just published a couple of years ago now by Donald Schreiber. He calls it Honest Patriots. Schreiber's a theologian. He used to teach down at Union Theological. He takes the example of 4 really traumatic situations in which the question is, have the perpetrating population really made an admission? Starts with Germany, contemporary Germany, where 3 generations now away from the Shoah, it has become very much a part of the culture to memorialize the Shoah experience itself. I've been instructed that Shoah is the word, not Holocaust. You find monuments. Germans have a very interesting vocabulary distinction. They can have a Denkmal monument remind you of it, or they can have a Mahnmal, a warning memorial. And warning Mahnmals are all over Germany now. People are all taught the necessity. And the one that really struck me was a very upper-class suburb outside Berlin, where in the Nazi period, all of the Jews had disappeared one by one. Everyone kept quiet. Didn't notice. They had built a mirror wall in the center of town, that right where everyone has to pick up the public transportation. They have to go by it to get into it's a stainless steel wall that is mirror, and in which are engraved the pictures and the names and dates of the disappearance of all the Jews who disappeared in the place. And you look into this and you see your own face. That as a type of constant memorial. In South Africa, they have been through the Truth and Reconciliation, whether they actually admit or not. His other instances are the United States. What have we admitted about the American Indians? What have we admitted? What have we done to internalize and face the wrong that has been done to Black Americans? Not only slavery, but Jim Crow. And where is the honest patriot? The one who can face this. Those are the kinds of things that really count. Are you going to have a recognition of what's happened or not? I've had this out in Northern Ireland with IRA people who will tell me at this point, we're not ready for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission because nobody has admitted anything. Not themselves, not the Protestants, not the British.
Worker John, do you want to answer that?
No, I agree that in Northern Ireland there is denial of, I didn't do anything wrong. The only people that the IRA think did anything wrong with the Brits. The only thing that the Protestant community didn't think there's anything wrong with the IRA.
Although, this I've always had from the loyalist paramilitary group, UDA, UPF both. Earliest conversations I had with them back around 1972, the conversation always began, we have done terrible things. We have to find the alternative. And that remains until you have the process of someone like Gusty Spence doing all of this reflection in the prison. Why are we here? How did we ever get to this? What is there in our history? And then insisting with all of his fellow Protestant prisoners, and then going to the wire. Going to the wire to talk to the Republican prisoners. He started off by telling them he wanted to learn Irish language. So, of course, that isn't what he went for. He wanted to learn the language, but he really wanted to know these people. Wanted to learn out how they tick, what's going on with them, and find where they were people like himself, and instruct both his own fellow prisoners on the Protestant side, and he effectively became a catalyst with the Republican Catholic prisoners of doing that same kind of reflection, with the result that the prison was able to become the place where the approaches to peace were thought through.
I think maybe another comment on that. The way some reconciliation takes place from the top down is to offer compensation. And I think when you alluded to like the Holocaust, you know, the slave laborers would be paid something. And if I recall correctly, there was an attempt just recently to offer compensation to the victims in Northern Ireland. But then one of the key people we've interviewed several different times, an IRA person who was mentioned here, he took part in an action with the IRA and 2 murders took place. And he says, well, am I a perpetrator, am I a victim? He says, look, I did take place in this, part in this operation. We did kill 2 people. But my brother was killed in retaliation. But I'm a victim because my brother's been hurt. So am I a perpetrator or am I a victim? So he would be someone who would be questionable, you know, do we offer compensation to his family?
Or he would get double the compensation.
Yeah, he was so good, I think he should have. Remember Tony Gag?
Yeah.
Missing teeth.
I think it brings up a little bit of a question when you talk about reconciliation, because there's a sort of a political process, but there's also an personal emotional process. So when you're talking about it, which are you referring to and which has to come first? It seems to me that giving somebody money is probably not going to take away pain, and it's not going to so much alleviate fear or the idea that you can't see outside yourself.
Well, this idea of giving money arose in Northern Ireland, where a commission that had been sitting for 2 years came out with a report in the end of January, I think, or the end of February, end of January. And among its recommendations was that every family that had endured a loss, a fatal loss in the troubles, be given £12,000 pounds, and it was just very badly handled. It was the only thing picked up at the news. It became an immediate political firestorm, and just about everybody rejected it, including Gordon Brown formally in Parliament. But it took away from the substance of the report, which was to establish, among other things, a legacy, a commission headed by somebody of international stature into the legacy of the past, which would be something along the lines of what the Truth and Reconciliation Commission did in South Africa. In South Africa, the trade-off was truth. If you told the whole truth about the atrocities you had committed and the gross violations of human rights you had committed, you then qualified, weren't given, but you qualified for amnesty. And there were some extraordinary scenes at public hearings of forgiveness where the perpetrator would say what he had done, and the family of usually the boy would be in the audience, and the black mother would stand up and say, "I forgive you," or he would ask for forgiveness. Very moving, but also very isolated. And a lot of blacks participated in these hearings because they thought they were going to receive reparations, and they didn't receive any kind of reparation. So it was kind of a backlash. I have very mixed feelings. Everyone sells something, and South Africa sells its Truth and Reconciliation Commission as the best way to bring about reconciliation. But it's okay. There's not going to be a fight between blacks and whites again. That's not going to happen. There's going to be equality. We move down a couple of levels, and whites are this total amnesia about the past. They pay no attention to it. Not every white, but most.
And Mary Jo wants to get in, but can I just ask you a quick question about this kind of prison experience? Because Mandela went through it, and Raymond just raised the example of Gusty Spence. Was there anything equivalent at all on the Catholic side? I mean, whether with Bobby Sands or any of the imprisoned hunger
As a matter of
strikers?
fact, yes, and it was much more obscure. I'll tell you, working with this over many years, I was hearing this as an effort on the part of the loyalists. I found out subsequently that back around, what year was it that Jerry Adams was rather briefly in prison? Was it 74? Somewhere in there.
When he was let out?
Yeah, he was in.
Yeah.
He was in the prison for a
Yeah.
relatively short time.
Yeah.
He and two other people were talking alternatives, peace alternatives, in the prison, and it was a very long process. He was IRA, of course. He became eventually Sinn Féin, and Sinn Féin was a kind of kept spokesman. No one in Sinn Féin was ever permitted to say anything that wasn't authorized by IRA. Effectively, it was important by Army Council. Jerry, over a long period of time, persuaded the Army Council to take up alternatives. He had the backing. This wasn't clear until after it happened, that he had the backing of Martin McGuinness in this, and a few other people. He carried on this really extraordinary, courageous conversation to have presented an alternative. One of my own findings in dealing with conflicts, people go into these saying we have no other option but shoot the violence as the only option, and of course this comes into all the famous just war theory, necessity. Is there any alternative? Well, people usually go into it, they'll try one or two alternatives they don't work, so that they can say we tried the alternatives. But actually, if people do understand really that there is another option, everybody understands whether they're going to study any just war theory or not. They do realize that if there is an alternative, violence is not a legitimate one. And to find my own practice in any of the conflicts I've worked in really is basically one of interpretation, an interpretation that has got to be done in conversation with every party to see what is actually happening, why is it happening, what's going on, and interpreted. Out of that interpretation, there always has to come new insight that will create a whole menu of alternative options. And if people actually see that some other option is real, they're going to take that.
What's it about prisons? I mean, is it that you're trying to reflect? Is it your
Many
suffering?
times
You go to a spiritual retreat. I mean, what is it about prisons?
Prisons are always universities. And in, say, in a political prison like the ones in Northern Ireland or the ones in South Africa or the ones in Palestine, people start off by doing military drill and planning the military operations. If they see that there are other options to be followed, then the prison becomes the place where you plan the peace.
There's also the matter that your perspective will begin to change if you are confined for a very long period to jail. You begin to look for ways out, and the ways out is to find a way to end the conflict, because all conflict ends with prisoners being released. So you have a very
Practical
motivation.
motivation.
Though it might seem it might not seem like that at the time, but you're psychologically you start to adjust to thinking about how do I get out of this. By saying how do I get out of this, you're really talking about how do we get out of this. You're now beginning to.
You know, Ray mentioned the Palestinian situation. There are thousands and thousands of prisoners there, and wouldn't it be very effective for them to start a similar process? So when we finish this film, Unexpected Openings, about the Northern Ireland prisoners, our field producer, Abby Chandler, had dozens and dozens of copies sent to some of the Palestinian prisoners and ex-prisoners to start a process, because each person thinks that it's a unique conflict, as you were saying. And Ray brought these films, 6 of them, to Bangkok in a peace thing, and people were seeing from different cultures what this process is. So just recently, we're trying to develop a curriculum for Kenya, especially after last year's disasters. And the Jesuits there are going to try to use this as a basis for their curriculum, because when they see it happening to someone else, they say, oh, geez, that's similar to us. But they're still objective enough to make some kind of decisions, and they don't feel threatened.
It's a very effective thing to see a process that's gone through, whether it's through a film or through various other ways of confronting it. What other people have gone through. I know in my own first year around Northern Ireland, 1972, I was constantly hearing stories. Wherever you went, people wanted to narrate. They wanted to tell the story of the terrible day, 1972. For most people, it was the internment day, 9th of August, 1971. They wanted to tell what had gone on in their street that day, and they could spend all day telling it. And we went back the next day, they wanted to start beginning and go right through it all again. I found that it was a very effective thing to talk about how people had dealt with other conflicts. Algeria was one of my instances. And this put their own experience into a different context, and they could understand what it had meant to Algerians, what it had meant to Cypriots, what it had meant to Israelis and Palestinians. And for that to enter into their conversation, even in this prisoner film, we have one of the prisoners describing the conversations that went on in the H blocks, in the IRA H blocks, where they discussed nuclear disarmament, nuclear war, Middle East, discussing all of these things, and they were very instructive for them. Yeah.
Very good. I think we're going to have to wind, but people need to go. But there were 2 people trying to get in, Mary Jo and Petra, so if we could maybe just take your questions, and then anybody wants to, or needs to go, and we can discuss it here. So Mary Jo and then Petra. Mary Jo behind you.
I was struck by contradictory references to how these conflicts pass down through the generations. I mean, that fascinating reference to Hamlet and so forth, and the idea that it's almost genetically passed on. And yet there were other references in the films and in the presentation of sons or granddaughters or something taking a different tack and trying to proceed with reconciliation. And so I wonder if you see any trends that have to do with time and the next generation or 2 generations down the way.
Maybe it's the moment of, sorry. Oh, then
And just
Petra.
let Petra
Okay,
in,
good.
because, and then
That's right.
we'll continue this when Petra has asked her question, and then we let people go who need to go. Yeah,
I guess my
Petra.
question is somewhat related, but I'm concerned about the fact that most of these talks and reconciliation is happening between people who are already starting the conflict, and then they resolve the conflict, and they still continue heading these countries. And I'm coming from Croatia, so I've seen this happen. So they still stay there, but nothing really changes for regular people who do follow the leaders still. They change with them. But if another leader comes along, it seems like when the conflict is not resolved in the society, those people follow that leader as well. So does that leader have to become a killer and then reconcile again to pacify it? I don't know if this is maybe more common than a question, but I do like, for that reason, the cities, the idea of cities speaking maybe needs to go down to friends, divided families. I don't know.
Good. I think we're going to formally adjourn, thank our speakers, and then we can continue afterwards. Thank you very much.